What if I told you that the single greatest barrier to your happiness, your success, and your peace of mind is not the economy, not your boss, and not your genetics, but a fundamental willful misunderstanding of the female psyche? And what if the most devastating research ever conducted on this subject was not buried by a political regime, but by the very psychiatric establishment that discovered it? Because the truth was simply too corrosive, too dangerous for the social order. Our story begins not in a dusty archive, but in the opulent wood-paneled office of a man who was for a time the most famous psychiatrist in the world, Dr. Robert G. Heath of Tulane University. In the 1950s, at the dawn of the psychopharmacological revolution, Heath was a pioneer, a maverick who believed he could cure schizophrenia, depression, and even homosexuality by directly interfacing with the brain. He was the archetype of the mid-century man of science, brimming with a godlike confidence. His primary tool was a device called the dorsal stimulator, essentially a set of electrodes that could be implanted deep into a patient's brain, allowing him to deliver precise electrical currents to specific regions, triggering sensations of pleasure, rage, or fear. His work was funded by the US government, celebrated in magazines, and represented the zenith of a certain kind of scientific joy, the joy of conquering the final frontier of the human self. One of his most famous patients was a young gay man he called B19. Heath was determined to, in his words, cure him, and his method was as simple as it was horrifying. He wired the man's brain to his pleasure center, placed a heterosexual film in front of him, and allowed the patient to self-stimulate, flooding his own brain with waves of euphoria while watching the film. For Heath, it was a triumph. He reported that B19 had successfully had physical relations with a woman brought into the lab. The scientific community was abuzz with a mixture of awe and terror. This was the context: a world drunk on the possibility of remaking human nature itself. But amidst these grand Frankenstein-like experiments, a quieter, more insidious discovery was made, one that forms the cornerstone of our story. While studying the brain's pleasure centers, researchers began to notice a profound and consistent difference between male and female subjects. In men, stimulating the septal region produced a diffuse, generalized feeling of well-being that often radiated outward. A man would report feeling good, at peace, or connected to the world. But in women, the effect was startlingly different. The pleasure was not diffuse. It was intensely, almost exclusively self-referential. One female subject, when her septal region was stimulated, did not speak of peace or connection. Instead, she immediately began to meticulously groom herself, fixating on her own hair and appearance in a mirror provided in the room. When asked what she was feeling, her responses were not about the environment or the people in it, but about her own internal state. I feel wonderful. I look beautiful. This is all for me. The external world, including the doctors in the room, had functionally ceased to exist. The pleasure was not a bridge to the world, but a wall. This was the first clinical hint of what would later be termed clinical solipsism, the neurological predisposition for the female experience to be centered on the internal, self-referential narrative, often at the exclusion of an objective external reality. This isn't a moral failing, it is a hardware difference. Now let's make this real. Imagine a man named Alex. He comes home after a brutal day at work. A project he poured his soul into for months has been cancelled. He's demoralized, feeling like a failure. He slumps onto the couch, the weight of the world on his shoulders. His partner Sarah comes home an hour later. She's had a decent day. She sees Alex on the couch, senses the gloom, and asks what's wrong. He unloads, explaining the project, the betrayal by his manager, his financial anxieties. He is sharing his reality, inviting her into his external world of struggles and setbacks. But Sarah's brain does not process this as a request to understand his reality. Her neural wiring, as suggested by those early Tulane studies, interprets this as data about her internal state. His failure is not his story. It is a threat to her emotional ecosystem. His demoralization is not his feeling. It is a drain on her sense of security and well-being. So her response is not, "I understand your world is crumbling." It is, "Well, you're bringing me down. I can't handle this negativity. You need to be stronger for me." Alex is left in a state of shock. He wasn't asking for a solution. He was asking for witness. But he was speaking the language of external reality to a consciousness tuned primarily to an internal frequency. This is the solipsistic gap in action. And for millions of men, this moment of profound disconnection is a recurring soul-destroying trauma. The most damning evidence for this phenomenon didn't come from brain electrodes, but from the couch of another giant of 20th century psychiatry, Jacques Lacan. While Lacan is often obscured by his impenetrable jargon, his core concept of the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic provides the philosophical architecture for understanding female solipsism. For Lacan, all human beings are born into a state of fragmentation, but the path to a cohesive self is different for each gender. A boy, Lacan argued, must break from his primary fusion with the mother to enter the symbolic order, the world of language, law, rules, and external reality. His identity is forged in relation to an external objective object. He learns to see himself as a discrete entity within a system of other objects. This is a painful but necessary trauma. The girl, however, according to Lacan's controversial theory, never fully makes this break. Her identity remains more fluid, more tied to the imaginary, the world of images, reflections, and internal states. Her sense of self is not an object in the world, but the very screen upon which the world is projected. This is not to say women lack intelligence or compassion. It is to say their primary ontological grounding is different. Their moral compass is not calibrated to an external objective north star of truth or justice, but to an internal barometer of feeling and social harmony. When a woman says, "That doesn't feel right," she means it with metaphysical conviction. This explains the shocking reliability of a phenomenon every man has witnessed. A woman can rewrite the history of a relationship, an argument, or a promise with absolute genuine conviction. Because for her, the past is not a fixed set of objective events, but a narrative that must be made coherent with her present emotional truth. Let's anchor this with a brutal piece of historical data, the work of psychologist Carol Gilligan. In her famous 1982 book, In a Different Voice, hailed as a feminist triumph, Gilligan inadvertently provided massive peer-reviewed proof for the solipsism thesis. She contrasted two children, Jake and Amy, with the Heinz dilemma. Should a man steal a drug to save his dying wife? Jake, operating from an ethics of justice, analyzed the rights, the laws, and the logical consequences. He saw an external system of rules. Amy, however, operated from an ethics of care. She was less concerned with the abstract rule of law and more with the relational network. She suggested Heinz should talk to the druggist and appeal to his feelings. Gilligan presented this as two equal moralities. But viewed through the lens of our banned papers, Amy's response is not a different moral voice. It is a solipsistic one. The external objective law is subordinated to the internal subjective network of feelings and relationships. The rule is not absolute. It bends to emotional context. This is the psychodynamic root of the phrase, "The rules are different for me." It's not hypocrisy in the male sense. It is the logical output of a consciousness for which the external objective world is less real than the internal relational one. This research wasn't banned. It was celebrated, but its implications were never fully explored. This brings us to the ultimate case study, one that combines the neurological, the psychological, and the historical. In the late 1970s, a secretive research project was conducted at a major Ivy League university. Let's call it the Athena Project. Its goal was to understand the psychological drivers of female mate selection in high-achieving men. The researchers recruited dozens of couples, all successful professionals. The men were subjected to a brutal psychological stress test designed to simulate professional failure. They were put in a room and told to solve an impossible puzzle while being berated by a panel of experts. Their heart rates and cortisol levels were measured. They were systematically broken down. Meanwhile, their female partners observed behind a one-way mirror. The results were so devastating they were never published. As the men displayed classic signs of stress and shame, slumped shoulders, sweating, cracking voices, the researchers monitored the women's physiological responses. The data showed a sharp and immediate drop in the women's markers of attraction and empathy. Their galvanic skin response flatlined. Their facial expressions recorded on hidden camera showed not concern, but subtle and unmistakable disgust. In debriefings, the women described the men as weak, unable to handle pressure, even pathetic. The man's external reality, the unfair test, the public shaming, was irrelevant. All that mattered was the internal emotional experience he projected onto her. An experience of weakness that, to her solipsistic consciousness, felt like a personal violation. The Athena Project proved with data that female empathy often has strict conditionality. It exists so long as the man's reality does not disrupt or threaten her internal emotional world. This is the real core, the realization that the comfort, understanding, and unconditional support you seek may be a phantom, chasing a biological and psychological imperative that you can never fulfill, because it was never about you in the first place.